Good morning, Facebook. This is Will Briganti reporting live from Nasdaq's global headquarters in New York. Welcome to the third edition of Nasdaq Advisory Live, brought to you by Nasdaq Corporate Solutions. Joining me for today's market update is Msci, an investor relations advisory analyst with Nasdaq Advisory Services. Msci, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Will.
And for our viewers that are on the East Coast, we're experiencing quite a snowstorm today. But we are here, we are open, and the markets are open, and we're ready to roll.
And the trains are running.
The trains are running, exactly. So to kick things off, give us a quick recap on major markets activities from this week.
Absolutely. So four major themes that are driving markets and obviously impacting global markets. One was the jobs report that came out last Friday, as it does every first Friday of the month. Which was mixed to slightly dovish from the Fed's perspective. Politics obviously continues to dominate headlines since the November elections. The themes of pro-growth policies and deregulation and tariffs. Also Fed policy, which has been something that investors have been paying attention to over the last 8 years, is also another major theme. And finally, earnings.
Great, thank you so much for that quick recap. To dig into some detail, give us a short overview on that jobs report from last week.
Absolutely. So the jobs report was somewhat mixed to slightly dovish. In terms of jobs growth, we saw 225,000 jobs created, which was well above expectations. So from that perspective, it was very positive. However, wage growth was tepid at 0.1% vis-a-vis expectations of 0.3%, which ties into the whole theme of income growth in the United States over the last few years, which has been somewhat negative. And thirdly, on a positive note, 740,000 people entered the labor force, so that has been a positive. Also, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, they have a hiring plan, hiring index, and the level of job openings that they're seeing has been, the level is unprecedented since April 2006. So it's been 10 years that they've seen this level of optimism. So again, a lot of optimism in the market. We're seeing the Russell 2000 rally extensively since November, and also exhibiting some volatility.
Great, thank you so much. You know, before we started, you mentioned a little bit about emerging markets, the Msci index. Do you want to go into some detail on that?
Absolutely. So the Msci Emerging Market Index, again, this whole reflation theme that we've been experiencing since the election has impacted global markets, and we're seeing the Msci Emerging Market Index up 7% on an year-to-date basis. I think the S&P 500 is up in and around 2.2 to 3%. So again, a lot of the emerging markets are also positively affected by policies that are coming out from Washington.
Sure, thank you so much. Obviously, a major business story in today's news that we can see from today's Wall Street Journal in the B section is companies racing to refinance debt. We had discussed this in our prep today, that there looks to be some increase in debt refinancing. Can you go into some detail for viewers on that?
Absolutely. So corporate America issuers have been rushing to market in order to refinance debt. We saw some $100 billion of debt being refinanced, which is, I think, this level we haven't seen in decades. Two reasons behind that. One, interest rates are going up, and also investors are because of Federal Reserve hiking interest rates, and also Treasury yields have been spiking over the last few weeks. And as such, issuers want to save on interest payments, so they've been looking to refinance quite aggressively.
Great. Thank you so much for that recap.
Absolutely.
So let's switch gears a bit. Obviously, we're right in the thick of earnings. Any major updates on that front?
Sure. So earnings are up on a year-on-year basis, 8%. If we exclude energy, it's in and around 8.2, 8.3%. Remember that up until Q3, we were in an earnings recession. Earnings recession defined as flat to negative growth for a few quarters. So from that perspective, there's a lot of optimism with respect to earnings. We're looking at a PE, S&P 500 PE forward-looking around 7.3 times. Historically, it's been in and around 4.18 times. So again, a lot of optimism baked into valuations. And it just goes back to the theme that I've been discussing, the pro-growth agenda, also Federal Reserve policy, of keeping monetary policy loose, that has been juicing up valuations.
Great, thank you so much. Last question. Any significant economic indicators or other calendar items that our viewers should take note of going into next week?
Not much by way of actual macroeconomic data, but we do have some Federal Reserve officials speaking next week, particularly Janet Yellen. So it'd be interesting to see her take on the economy and if in fact the Federal Reserve will be hiking rates this year. They're projected to hike again 3 times this year. So investors and pundits will be parsing her words. Politics obviously will continue to dominate headlines. The timing of tax cuts, deregulations, their impact, and to what extent deregulation will happen. And finally, next Wednesday, I believe, February 15th, and when all the 13 Fs are due. So that should shed some interesting light as to how investors have or will be positioning themselves vis-a-vis this new administration.
Great. And speaking of 13 Fs, for some of our viewers on Facebook who may not be familiar with what a 13F filing is, Masood, can you give our viewers just a brief overview on what that is and why it's important?
Sure, absolutely. So every U.S. institutional investor that manages more than $100 million, and also some significant overseas investors are mandated by the SEC to file on a quarterly basis as to their positional holdings. So every quarter there is a 45-day lag. We get to see what the positions of investors are.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Obviously, all eyes on coming up next week on some further actions from the Federal Reserve, so we'll certainly keep an eye on that. Be sure to check back next week, Thursday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time, for our next Nasdaq Advisory Live update. Masood, thank you so much for joining me for today's program.
And enjoy the snow.
That's right. Thank you. Exactly. Hope to get out there at some point later today. Thank you to all of our viewers on Facebook. In the meantime, you can follow Nasdaq Corporate Solutions on Twitter at MyCorpSolutions, and be sure to visit our blog. That's at business.nasdaq.com. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Have a good one.